Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the Extra Mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now, your host, Jackson Mummy, owner of the Celebration Bar Review.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 274 of the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson Mummy. Glad to be with you. Hope everybody's doing well. Here we are in October. We are right in the midst of bar exam results season. And as this episode is releasing, maybe New York results have come out. I don't know. It seems like this is the time. My spidey sense tells me this might be the week when it's happening. So good luck to everyone waiting on those results. And of course, for everyone waiting on the results around the country, we wish you the very best. We do expect results to come out in some other fairly large jurisdictions over the next couple of weeks. We would expect New Jersey to be coming out, perhaps DC. We're never quite sure when they're going to release their results. Last week, we got results out in Illinois and Colorado and in a couple of other UBE states. Tennessee was one of those, for example. And so congratulations to everyone that passed their exams in those states. For those of you that did not pass, we understand the frustration and discouragement that creates, and we're here to help you get your life back together and get your studies started and get you over the top and to make the next bar exam your last bar exam. So I'm glad you found us and glad you're here with us today. Now, in today's episode of the podcast, we're starting a two-part series. I'm pretty excited about it. Today, we're going to be looking at what I call changing paradigms in the bar exam. I'm going to be taking you through a slide presentation I did with the help of my friends at Learning Strategies. They're the people that created PhotoReading and Paraliminal recordings. And this is part of an excerpt from our boot camp training that we do, our live training for our bar review students at Celebration Bar Review. I think you're going to really find it interesting. We're going to look at the paradigm shifts that you have to make in order to be successful on the exam. We're going to look at it in terms of brain processing. Your conscious processing and your non-conscious processing. It's a little technical, but I think you're going to find it really interesting. Now, I would encourage you to actually watch this week's episode so that you can get the benefit of the slide presentation. And you can do that by going to celebrationbarreview.com/274. That's the episode number. Now, if you prefer to listen to the podcast, that's fine. But some of the information you may say, I'm not sure I know exactly what he's talking about. Maybe you want to go back later and watch it. But you can certainly listen to the podcast as always. We're available on Apple Podcasts, on iHeartRadio, on Spotify, almost anywhere that podcasts are syndicated. Love to have you subscribe and listen to the podcast as well. And then we've got all of our previous episodes on our website under the case studies tab on our site. So you can check that out as well. Now, before we jump into today's message about changing paradigms, I want to let you know that our episode is being brought to you by our all-new free 90-minute training program. It's called Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. This is a look at the 4 steps that you need to follow in order to be successful on the test. We use lots of successful student case studies. You'll hear from them in their own words. We've got lots of video interviews that we've incorporated into the presentation. But we also just take you step by step. Here's what you got to do. Here's the process that you have to follow. And it's incredibly valuable and it's totally free. The best part about it, from my way of thinking about it, is that it's now available in an on-demand format. In other words, you can watch this presentation at the date and time that works best for you. If you have questions, you'll have a way to send those to us directly and we'll be glad to respond. As I said, this is totally free training, but you do need to register, and you can do that in a couple of different ways. You can go to the show notes here on the video or audio page and sign up there, or you can go to our website at celebrationbarreview.com/webinar and register there. And then we'll see you on the webinar for this free training that will show you step-by-step what you have to do something different and make the next bar exam your last bar exam. All right, well, I don't want to keep you waiting. I want to jump into this part 1 of a 2-part series. We're going to look today at changing paradigms, and then in next week's episode, we're going to actually apply that concept to something that we call pattern recognition for the bar exam. I think it's really fascinating stuff. It's really cutting edge, and it's the work that we've been doing successfully with students for a while now. And I wanted to bring it out and share it with you so that you could get an idea of what's possible when you study for the bar exam. And it should be really encouraging, I think, to everybody. So sit back, strap yourself in, and get ready to learn a little bit about how this magnificent machine called our brain actually works. And let's talk about changing paradigms. Well, today I want to talk about changing paradigms when it comes to studying and taking the bar exam. You might say, what do you mean by a paradigm? Well, a paradigm is essentially a framework that you use to think about the test, to think about how you study for the test, to think about how you approach the exam. We use paradigms in almost everything that we do in the world, and we certainly have paradigms about test taking. For example, if your paradigm about the bar exam is that it's a test that measures how much law you can memorize, then you would study appropriately. You would do flashcards and mnemonics. You'd spend a lot of time trying to cram information into your brain. Conversely, if your paradigm was that the bar exam is testing your ability to reason and think like a lawyer, you would study differently. Now, what I want to think about today is a changing set of paradigms when it comes to this idea of preparation for the exam and thinking about how the brain decodes information. And I want to share with you some thoughts about that in this particular discussion. Later, we will dig deeper into this whole idea of pattern recognition, because that's a whole additional topic that really gets into some of the techniques specifically. Now, when it comes to changing paradigms, the reason that we think about this for the bar exam is that there has been so much work done in the last 25 or 30 years in the educational field about how people learn, how they best learn, and how they retain the information that they're learning. Some of those areas you see on the screen here, there's been a great deal of work in the area of educational kinesiology, which is much harder to say than it is to do. Sometimes it's called a brain gym. It's simply connecting up the way that our bodies move with the way our minds work. I've been talking about this for a number of years because I was very fortunate to do my early educational training with Howard Gardner at Harvard. And we looked at multiple intelligences and how that worked, even from small children up through adults. And we found that activity and movement created a different kind of intelligence, spatial and kinesthetic intelligences, that were very important to what we thought of as traditional intelligences, verbal and mathematical. So educational kinesiology is an important paradigm. It's something to keep in mind. Another kind of paradigm is an area that sometimes is called tapping, but it's emotional freedom technique. It's simply releasing what's already inside your brain, inside your physical body, into a more conscious understanding of the world. There's also the idea or the paradigm of just centering yourself and what's called a heart focus. You know, it's really interesting. If you do meditation, there's some great tools out there, and we'll link to them. But one of them is built on this idea of heart math. You can actually sync up your heart rate to your breathing rate to meditation. And in doing that, you create a much more self-aware and centered approach to learning and to repeating back and just demonstrating what you've already learned. Another type of changing paradigm in education today is what we call collaborative learning. It simply means that you are learning to collaborate, to think with others, and to bring together different modalities. Now, for us, that often means mind mapping, interactive work in something like a Facebook group, coming to live boot camp training sessions, and so on. But instead of being completely and totally isolated, the traditional factory model of education, collaborative learning is problem solving. And for lawyers and for bar takers, collaborative learning is very, very important. And of course, the other paradigm that I don't think can go unmentioned is that a supportive environment is important. I was talking to someone just the other day who was telling me that they felt like the whole bar exam process is adversarial. And I think that's true. I think it starts in law school, where you're terrified typically by some 1L professor. It's the Lion Tamer is what they're called on the faculty. And their job is to bring you into submission. It's to get you so afraid that you'll do whatever they ask you to do, hence the idea of the Lion Tamer. But the reality is that a supportive environment actually is what enables learning. You know, the terror of law school 40 or 50 years ago was not a great way to learn. Today, we see a lot more of this supportive environment. What can we do to help you? What can we do to get the most out of you, to get you to perform at your best? And so a supportive environment is an important paradigm when it comes to preparing for the exam. So those are a few of the paradigms that we want to consider. With that in mind, in terms of the paradigms, we also have a problem. And the problem is really fundamentally quite simple. The problem is that you have a lot of information in your head. You learned a lot. You learned it in life. You learned it in college. You learned it in law school. Yes, in fact, even if you sat in the back row and ignored everything that was being said, you still learned a lot. And then you learned it in the bar review, and you learned it in your legal practice, and you learned it in all the things you do every day. It's all there. You have the capacity to do all of that. What's the problem? You can't get to it. It's just like our lockbox here. It's got so many locks on it. There's so many barriers to getting through the information that you need that it seems almost impossible. Now, I'm of an era where I remember a TV show called Get Smart, and it was a funny show back in, I want to say maybe the 60s. But what I remember most about it was the opening sequence in which the secret agent, Maxwell Smart, is walking into his secret agent lair, and he has to walk through all of these different doors and places that close, these steel doors that close behind him and trap doors that come down. And it's just one level after another, after another, after another. And he goes all the way through like 10 or 15 of these with these big heavy metal doors closing, through the elevator, down to the bottom, and finally he picks up his shoe to talk into his shoe. And we thought that was hysterical, but now we talk into our wrists. So in any event, my point is that we are like Maxwell Smart walking through that very long hallway with all the doors closing behind us. We learn something and then we close ourselves off to it. We don't recognize what we already know, or we can't get to it, and then we get frustrated. And on the bar exam, this is really a huge challenge, because what occurs is that we become so locked up in knowing that we have the information, but we can't retrieve it right at that moment. And all those flashcards, all those mnemonics, all those hours spent cramming, all that underlining and highlighting suddenly means nothing, because you just can't get at the material. So that's the problem we want to try and resolve. Now, along with that problem comes a whole series of negative messages. And I've got a few of them up here, but we do negative self-talk, all of us, all the time. Things like, I can't do that, I'm not good enough, remember what happened the last time I took the bar, or that'll never work. In fact, as you're watching and listening, perhaps you've had some of those messages already going through your mind. Get real, or I can't afford to do this, even though you don't have any idea if there's a cost or not. But we do all of those things. My favorite is not another harebrained scheme. I mean, what is it that this guy's telling me now? I get that. We all do that. It's a common technique, and it goes with our lockbox. We've got the lock. All we got to do is figure out how to open the locks and we can get at it. But instead of looking for the keys to the lock, what we do is we bombard ourselves with all these negative messages, all the things that tell us that we can't do something. And that is incredibly frustrating. It's also very non-productive. And so that collaborative environment and supportive environment I was talking about become really important to help break down all of those areas. And by the way, if you're wondering about this picture, this is a form of a mind map. Just want to say that. All right. Now, one of the things that I love is the story of Helen Keller, because Helen Keller didn't understand or recognize as she was growing up that she had these limitations. But she says the reason for that was that Anne Sullivan, her mentor, her teacher, as she said, was never conscious of Anne's limitations. You see, we become so conscious of our limitations that we can't see anything else. But Helen Keller wasn't aware that she couldn't speak or talk or hear. It didn't matter. She didn't know those things. She just knew she existed. And because she didn't become aware of her limitations, she thought she could do anything. And in point of fact, she did. She accomplished amazing, extraordinary things. But she says it's because she had a teacher that wasn't conscious of her limitations. In a very real sense, that's what each of us have to do. We have to get rid of our limitations and start looking for the keys to unlock that padlock or series of padlocks in our box. And so that's what we want to talk about here. I think it's important to recognize that there are some things we understand about how the human body works, and it has to do with information flow. You see, we have a sensory system, our eyes, our nose, our taste, and so on, and that brings information into our bodies. And then we're going to get some of that information in certain bits per second bandwidth. So for example, our eyes can bring in 10 million bits per second of information. That's a lot. Our ears bring in 100,000 bits of information per second. Our skin takes in 1,000,000 bits of information per second. A lot going on there. Our taste buds, only 1,000. We have very slow moving taste buds apparently. And our sense of smell, 100,000. All right, that's the bandwidth that's coming into us. But here's the interesting part. What do we perceive? What are we conscious of? Well, it's just a tiny fraction. Our eyes take in 10 million bits of information per second, but we're only conscious of 40 bits per second, 40. Now that's a huge, huge drop off. Why is that? Well, we'd go crazy if we tried to process all 10 billion bits of information per second and consciously be aware of them. So our brain does us a favor. It filters out the things we don't need, and it only makes us conscious of 40 bits per second. The same is true with our hearing. We only are conscious of 30 bits per second. Our skin, 5 bits per second. I'm cold, I'm hot, there's a bee on my, wrist, whatever it might be. Our sense of taste, 1 bit per second. We can only take one taste at a time. And our sense of smell, 1 bit per second. So what happens is the information flow is great in the universe, and then our body takes that and it filters it down. Now that's important for us to recognize, because if we're going to unlock those padlocks in our problem, we've got to understand how to get from some of that bigger bandwidth beyond our conscious bandwidth limit. In other words, we're not going to try and expand your conscious bandwidth, but we do know that there's more out there to work with. I think of it as being a little bit like this iceberg. You know, above the waterline, we can see the tip of it, and it's imposing. There's a lot there. What we don't see is everything that's under the waterline. And as you notice here, it's huge. It's many more times greater than what we're able to perceive. And that's a good representation of what happens to us when we're trying to process information. We see the information in front of us. Oh, here's a subject I have to study. But there's way more information that we already understand and have in our non-conscious brains that's below the surface. It's invisible to us. Now, another way to think of this is as levels of consciousness. You see, most of us function at the conscious level, but we also, all of us, have a non-conscious level. Now, what that means, if we go to the top at the conscious level, is that we have something called focal awareness, or it's sometimes called reflective consciousness, or primary consciousness. And what we mean by those terms is simply that we see things, we hear things, we respond to things, we are aware of what's going on around us. I'm now reading a multi-state question in contract law. I am consciously aware of that problem. I'm aware that I'm working on it. My primary consciousness is on the words on the page and what's going on around me. That is where my focus is on that day when I'm doing the MBE or I'm taking a practice question. But you know, while that's going on, if you stop for a minute and think about it, there's a whole lot of things happening below the surface, so the bottom part of our iceberg. And we call this peripheral awareness. I have some general sense. How warm is the room? What's the person next to me doing? How's my time management going? Is my pencil sharp enough? Am I, bubbling the right marks on the sheet? And this is our peripheral awareness. And it starts to be the boundary between conscious and non-conscious work. Now, in our non-conscious brain, we have a range from low to high. Material that's available to our consciousness comes up nearer the top. It's high non-conscious. And then there's material that's so low we can't get at it at all. So some examples of high non-conscious would be some stimuli that we don't consciously perceive, but they're available to us. We know that there's something going on. What does that sound? Oh, there's something outside. If I stop and think about it, I'm aware of it. I've just been hearing it. This also includes, and more important for our purposes, is that there are easily retrieved memories. Now that's important, and if you're writing or taking notes, easily retrieved memories are important because they begin to open the door to pattern recognition. If it is an easily retrieved memory, oh, that reminds me of, I'm doing this contracts question, and it reminds me of the mailbox rule, this fact pattern that I'm looking at. Gee, I wonder what I did with that before. It was not my first level of awareness, but I now have, if I stop and reflect for a moment, I have some sense of what's going on. The other way to think about this is not only the easily retrieved memories, I mean, it says something like mailbox rule, but there's also the memories that are retrievable with cueing. Now, what we mean by cueing is I see a word or phrase or a pattern, and that cues me up. So when I see that it's a contract of sale for real property, and the fact pattern says they just shook hands but didn't write anything down, that's a cue to me. That tells me, gee, I wonder if there's something missing. Would statute of frauds be part of that? It's a cue. It's something that then gets me to a more easily retrieved memory. But that may not be my primary consciousness. It may not be the first thing that I notice. I have to read for the words and get that information. Now, all of those things are in the high non-conscious, and we want to be able to attract and retrieve them when we need them in order to have best performance on the exam. But you notice they're below that threshold of peripheral awareness. They are not the first things you will notice when you read the question. So we have to be able to dig into them to get at that information. Then lower in the non-conscious, we have what we call the stimuli that are non-consciously perceived, but also unavailable. Our bodies are constantly aware of what's going on. Is there enough oxygen in the room? Are we blinking enough? Are we breathing? It's all the basic functions. You're not consciously aware of any of those things. You've been breathing and blinking and doing all the things you have to do while this particular discussion has been going on, and you haven't given it a bit of thought until I just mentioned it. It is a stimuli that's non-consciously perceived, and it's unavailable to you at a conscious level. It's just really, really deep. And that's fine. We don't need that for our purposes. If you start thinking about your breath and your heart rate while you're doing the bar exam, it's because something's gone wrong, not because things are going right. Now, this level also includes the very hard to retrieve memories. These are the things that are so deeply buried that you're just not going to get at them. And certainly under a time test, it's just not going to be there for you. And you don't need to worry about it. If it's that deeply buried, you don't need to think about it or worry about it. If it is a hard, repressed memory, don't fret it and don't worry about it. Now, when we think about all of those kinds of non-conscious and conscious levels, we know that there are different kinds of knowledge that we want to be functioning in. One kind of knowledge is called declarative knowledge. This means that I can recite, I can declare what I know. It's episodic, it's semantic, it's got words. I know what I know. I can tell you what I know. I can write about what I know. This is good stuff. We like declarative knowledge. We also like procedural knowledge. How do these things work? What's the process or the procedure that we use? How do we get to a result? That's also happening at the non-conscious level as well as the conscious level. And then there's sensory input. There's a lot of stuff happening, and we can filter that in or out as we need it. So our brains are remarkable machines, remarkable creations, and we are able to work consciously and non-consciously simultaneously. And we move back and forth through that peripheral awareness from the high non-conscious into the conscious level and back and back and back. The goal each time is to continue getting a deeper understanding. Remember, our goal is to unlock that padlock or series of padlocks to the treasure box of information that's in our brain. Now, I talk about this idea of peripheral awareness, and it also leads us to a discussion of something called a preconscious processor. That's just another way of thinking about a part of your brain. And this is the part of your brain that perceives and discriminates and responds to information in milliseconds. As you've been listening and watching today, your brain has been preconsciously processing. Before I said the words of perceive, discriminate, respond to information in milliseconds, your brain already perceived all that. You saw it. In fact, you may have even formed the words in your mind before I said them. It only took literally milliseconds, less than a second for you to do all of that. And we do it every day in thousands and millions of ways. We preconsciously process everything we see, everything we hear, everything that we smell and taste and feel. It's all there, and it's happening all the time. Now, the purpose of discussing that in our context is that your brain is doing all of that work. It is preconsciously processing a lot of information. The difficulty is you can get overwhelmed with it. There can be too much information. So how does your brain protect you? It simply filters out, as we saw before, and says, you don't need all of that other information. Here's what you really need to know. If we can channel what our preconscious processor sends to our conscious brain, we're going to have a much better understanding of the material that we need to be successful in essays or multiple choice questions. Now, moving from the preconscious processor, we get into a concept called information processing. How do we process the information then that comes into us? Our preconscious processor is doing a lot of work. What do we do with it? Well, we have what we call the dominant processor. This is the part of our brain that gets information and it analyzes, it reasons, it interprets, it judges, it keeps rules, it sets goals. We would think of this as being our left brain. And the left brain, the left side of the human brain, does all of that. That is the dominant side of our brain. And if you're in law, and obviously you are, this is going to be the side that's probably overgrown a bit. You've actually beefed this one up. You've been spending time in the brain gym working on the dominant side of your thought process, and that's fine. But then there's another part of your brain, the non-dominant part, and this is the right brain. This is the part that senses what's going on holistically. It looks at the bigger picture and it sees the whole problem. It creates, it intuits, it comprehends, it makes new rules. Ooh, that's really important. And it explores options. Now, I want to just stop for a minute and ask you, as you think about the bar exam, how do you use those two parts of your brain? I mean, the dominant part of your brain would say, here's a problem in front of me. I'm going to analyze it. I'm going to reason my way to a result. I'm going to interpret the words in the question. I'm going to make a judgment about who wins. I'm going to keep all the rules that I memorized right in front of me, and I'm going to set a goal. I got to get this question right. Be honest, you've all done it. We all do it. That's how most of us think we should answer questions, right? Using the dominant side of our brain. So we shut down the right-hand side of our brain and we say, dominant left brain, you go take care of this problem. That's a big mistake because the other side of our brain, that non-dominant right-hand side of our brain, is very, very important to answer questions correctly. And here's what we have discovered over the past 25 years in thinking about how people take tests, particularly multiple choice tests. When you use the non-dominant brain as well, you see great improvement in scores. Why? Well, the non-dominant part of your brain looks at the whole picture, the whole question in front of you and says, what result would make sense to me? Who should win this? What is this question about? It's a holistic approach first. It doesn't try to get into the weeds. It takes a 30,000-foot view. This is also the part of your brain that creates and thinks about the problem more creatively. This is particularly important when we get to essays and performance tests. How can I create an answer that makes sense? What is my structure? Now, in order to get at that creation part, I have to know some things to be sure, but I have to have the creative part of my brain working. I love this third item about intuition. In fact, we use a trademark term called selective intuition to try and focus in just on this non-dominant skill. Your intuition will tell you most of the time the correct answer to a question. You've done this all your life. You've had intuition about everything. You had intuition about the bar review course to take. You had intuition about the person that you chose to spend your life with. You had intuition about the schools you were going to go to. You had intuition about whether or not you should cross the street or buy this car or take that way to work. You've had intuition about everything. What am I going to order on the menu for dinner tonight? My intuition will tell me something. Isn't it interesting, however, that on the bar exam, most of us shut off our intuition entirely as though it's some sort of an evil force that would hurt us, when in fact it's there to really guide us. One of the most popular books in culture today is Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink. And Blink talks about this idea of intuition, and he puts it in a very simple way. He says, you have an instantaneous reaction to almost everything. If you trusted that more often, your intuition would guide you more appropriately. And I think he's correct about that. The non-dominant brain also helps us comprehend what's going on. You know, sometimes you can be reading a long fact pattern or performance test materials, and you suddenly look up and go, I have no idea what I'm reading. Or maybe that's happened to you as you're reading your bar review outlines. You're so much in the detail that you have no comprehension. It's the non-dominant part of the brain that comprehends. It puts material together and says, here are the connections. That's why we use mind maps. It helps us comprehend how these rules work together. And as you saw, it makes new rules. As we create mind maps, our non-dominant brain says, oh, I bet this goes with this. This idea connects up to this idea. And we start creating these connections. We make new rules instead of being limited to the old rules that we had memorized. And importantly, it explores options. What could I do with that? What are the options here? What makes sense intuitively? And we explore those options. So you can see how the non-dominant brain working together with the dominant brain give you a whole approach to answering questions that most of you aren't getting because you're using just the dominant brain. Now, if you're curious about knowing more about that, we use a tool called PhotoReading, and we explain in great detail how PhotoReading fits into that dominant, non-dominant paradigm. But I just want to give you the sense right now, because even if you're not a photo reader, you can use your non-dominant brain. Now, to put this into another way of thinking about it, there are expanded brain states that we know from being able to measure brain waves. And we know that there is a channel of brain wave activity that's called the creativity channel. That's 5 to 7 hertz. And then a little higher is 8 to 12 hertz, the learning channel. This is where you should be when you're studying for the bar exam. 12 to 15 hertz is a relaxation channel. This is what you do after you're studying for the bar exam when you just need to chill. And then finally, there's 16 to 30 hertz. This is the action channel. And this is where a lot of bar takers end up going on the exam itself, but you can see it's where you're stressed, you're making critical judgments, you're using reason. There's some value, obviously, in all of that, but you don't want to spend the entire bar exam up in the action channel. You want a little bit of the relaxation channel as well, because you'll notice that the relaxation channel lets you be in an accelerative learning state. You're physically relaxed, but mentally alert. And that's really where we want you on the bar exam. So somewhere between 12 to 15 hertz for most of it, and occasionally bumping up to 16 to 30 hertz. So the brain doesn't operate at one speed. It operates at multiple speeds, and you want to take advantage of each of those. Now, I want to point out that when the brain does its work, it is remarkable in its ability to recognize patterns. As I said, we're going to talk in another video about this pattern recognition, but I want to just share this brief screen with you. And my suggestion is that you take a moment and read it out loud or read it to yourself and see what the words are, see whether or not you can read it. Now, what you're going to discover as you're looking at that is that what you're reading there is that you can read it, but it's misspelled. It's wrong almost everywhere all the way through. And the key is what we discovered, and what they discovered in research at Cambridge University, was that it didn't matter what order the letters of a word were that you were reading. The only important thing was the first and last letter had to be in the right place. And if you go back and analyze this, you'll see that in every word, the first and last letter are in the right place. The rest of it is a complete mess. It's just a jumble. But why is that work? Why is it that I can look at those words that are completely misspelled and I understand them completely accurately? The reason is that the human mind doesn't read letter by letter, even though that's the way most of us have been taught to read. That's not how it works. What it does is it sees the word as a whole. It does something called pattern recognition. And then using the paradigms that we've been talking about, the brain brings that information together and says, well, it's a misspelled word, but I know what that word means. So for those of you who have been worried about your typing on the bar exam, just get the first letter and the last letter correct, and it doesn't matter what goes in between, and you'll be fine. That's our takeaway. But what I really want you to get out of this is that there is amazing power in recognition, because the brain can see and do much more than we give it credit for. And so some of you have been thinking, oh my gosh, I've got to get it perfect. I've got to have it right. You don't need to do that. Your brain is already doing way more for you as you're going through material. Now, here's another way of experiencing the same thing. I want you to take a moment, if you're watching this, and read this particular screen and see if you can read it. What's fascinating about this, and if you're listening, I'll just tell you, this is a particular sentence that is written upside down and backwards. That is, you're reading, instead of going from left to right, you're going right to left, and you're going upside down. I have done this experiment with thousands of people, and I have yet to find one that couldn't read it. Our brain is capable of doing that. Why is that? Well, because what comes into our eyes is upside down and backwards anyway, and our brain decodes it. We work it through and we bring it back the way that we need it to understand it. So what we would tell you is that you are incredibly talented, because you're now able to read upside down and backwards. And that's a very valuable talent to have. And if you are a photo reader, we're actually going to have you read upside down and backwards, because it doesn't matter. Your brain is taking all of that same information and decoding it again so that you can use it. Now, if you're asking, what does this have to do with studying and taking the bar exam? It's not saying that you should read the questions upside down and backwards. All we're trying to do is to make the point that you have, within that padlock box that we looked at, you have all the information you need. The problem is you're not using the key to unlock the padlocks. And here are some keys that you have. You have the ability to read and understand way more than you think you do. And most of you have been using your dominant mind. You've been in the conscious processor, the iceberg above the water, and you've been focusing just there, but you know the greater mass is underneath. It's the preconscious processor, which is doing all this work we're just demonstrating for you. Now, the learning process itself really goes through a multiple number of steps. And what I want to leave you with today is that when you are starting and going through your studies, you're really beginning at the bottom in what we call unconscious incompetence. You don't know what you don't know. You're not aware of your limitations yet. And so you're just out there bumbling around. You're excited, but you're scared. And that's a good definition of most bar takers when they begin. They're excited and feared. They've never taken the bar. They don't know what to expect. They don't know how to study, and they are unconsciously incompetent. Well, then for an awful lot of people, they go through and they take the bar exam and they don't succeed. That's a sad truth. And they reach what's called conscious incompetence. This is that now you become really painfully aware of what you don't know. I didn't know these rules. I didn't know how to write essays. I didn't know how to take the exam. I didn't know how to pass the exam. And this leads to frustration and confusion. It's a terrible place to be. But it's a necessary place to go in the learning process. And I'm not saying that everyone has to fail the bar in order to learn. There can be moments of conscious incompetence for ultimately successful bar takers. I'm simply saying that if you're someone that took the exam and failed, you are at conscious incompetence and you may not have moved beyond it yet. So if you're feeling frustration and confusion, this is a natural step in the learning process. But the good news is there's 2 more steps after this if you're willing to take them. The third step in the process is called conscious competence. This is when you become aware of what you need to know. You listen to podcasts, you watch videos, you take bar review courses, you study, you learn, you become more proficient. You are beginning to develop confidence. This is the part of the point where you know material, you know what to do, and you're still learning how to use it. Maybe you're learning how to photo read. Maybe you're learning how to do mind maps. You're learning how to use selective intuition. You're learning how to use the non-dominant part of your brain. Those are all good things, and you can do those. And as you do them, you begin to develop confidence. Now, you're not out there beating your chest saying, look at me, I'm king of the world, but you're beginning to get some confidence. You moved away from conscious incompetence, that frustration and confusion, to something that's much more valuable. And as you begin to develop confidence, it's a much more effective place to be. You could actually pass the bar exam with conscious competence, just like you passed your driver's test probably when you're 16 years old. You weren't a great driver, but you were consciously competent. You paid attention, you could do just fine. It was that next month when you weren't paying attention, you got into your first accident. But the conscious competence is an acceptable level. But then ultimately in the learning process, the highest goal is what we call unconscious competence. This is automatic integration of what you've learned. When it becomes habit and routine for you, it is mastery. And I've seen students go from failing the bar exam to mastery on the bar exam, raising their scores by 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 points or more. I've seen people who have failed the bar exam over a period of decades who passed the bar exam, who've gone from unconscious incompetence to unconscious competence. But they don't go in a single step. They go step by step. They have to go, all of us have to go through all of those steps of conscious incompetence and conscious competence and ultimately unconscious competence. Now, if you get to the bar exam and you've got mastery, unconscious competence, you are going to pass. You may not get there. Not everyone will get there in every respect. But if you are at that level, that's great news. But it is the learning process that all of us follow. And it comes with a certain amount of emotional baggage, from that fear and excitement ultimately up to mastery. So what we really have been talking about today is creating a paradigm that lets you go through that learning process, to start to think about what you have to do. What I wanted to do with this information today was to just get you to start thinking about these ideas, particularly of the dominant and non-dominant mind, the conscious and preconscious processor. As you start to work with those ideas, I think what begins to happen is you start asking questions. Am I studying the right way for the exam? Am I doing the things that would make me successful on the bar exam? Maybe my paradigm has been incorrect. And if that's the case, that can be something of great concern for you. And so I just want to remind you that this is something that you can certainly do and work on to help yourself get ready and to be prepared for the bar exam. Now, in our next message, I'm going to talk about how we apply all of these techniques into this idea of pattern recognition, how you begin to use the non-conscious processor when you're doing essay questions, performance tests, multi-state, multiple choice questions. And it's a huge game changer, and it really moves the needle for people. It changes their results from failing to passing. And that's what we're going to do. But we wanted to give you this basis now, give you something to start to think about and consider in terms of the way you think and learn. If you want to know more about these particular skills, I invite you to contact us. We use techniques like photo reading and mind mapping. We use the paradigms that I just talked about, heart math and tapping and some of these other techniques, because they enhance our non-dominant process and bring it back into sync with our dominant brain process. And they're very, very effective. And I encourage you to check those out. All right, well, we'll be back in our next video and episode to talk about how we use the process of pattern recognition in order to be successful on the bar exam. Well, again, I want to thank our friends at Learning Strategies for helping me create this slide deck and for their work and assistance with me, particularly Dr. Paul Scheele. The work that he is doing in brain research and that we're applying to our work in the bar exam is really exciting stuff. And I really hope that that was valuable for you to get a feeling about this idea of changing paradigms. Now remember, in next week's episode, we're going to now take that information, we're going to apply it to the idea of pattern recognition and show you precisely how you go about applying that non-conscious processing, that non-dominant brain processing, to be able to answer questions, whether they're essays or multiple choice, in a more effective way. So make sure you stick around and stay tuned for that upcoming episode. And then before we leave you this week, again, I want to remind you that we've got our free webinar training. It's called Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. It's an on-demand presentation, but you do need to register. You can do that by clicking on the registration button on the show notes here for the podcast, or by going to celebrationbarreview.com/webinar. All right, well, that's our episode for this week. Thanks for being with us. Good luck to everyone who's waiting on their exams. We know there's still lots of jurisdictions out there. We'll see Georgia results, Texas results, California results all coming up in the next month or two. And we think New York is certainly imminent, and New Jersey, a couple of other big UBE jurisdictions. So best wishes to everyone, and we will see you next week along the Extra Mile.
Thanks for listening to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at www.celebrationbarreview.com.